Hi all, Anthony Wilson, the Communications Director for the City of San Angelo. It's Tuesday afternoon, which means we are fresh off of another City Council meeting, and easily the topic of the day was food trucks and the rules that apply to where and when and how food trucks may operate. And so, in order to talk more about that and explain what's going on with food trucks and new food truck rules, I've asked John James, our Planning and Development Services Director, to join us today. John, thanks for being with us.
Sure, thank you.
Now, I've been referring to these as new food truck regulations, but that's probably not quite right because a lot of the talk today involved allowing food trucks to operate in even more locations than they've ever been able to before.
That's right. Under our current rules, which were really written years ago without food trucks in mind, food trucks are really not allowed in many areas of the city, and this ordinance does open that up to many areas like near churches and schools and parks, other situations where they just aren't allowed today.
And so has it been the proliferation of food trucks that led to the crafting of these new rules?
Yes, as we've seen more and more food trucks come into the city, we thought it was time to address specifically food trucks and look at what we think as a city the rules should be for those.
And how much input did the food truck vendors actually have in this process and in the new rules that were adopted by our City Council today?
Quite a bit. We held a couple of forums where we invited food truck owners, and those were well attended, and we got a lot of good feedback. We did present an early draft of some of the regulations, which they commented on, and we made some changes to the draft ordinance based on some of the comments and concerns we heard from the food trucks. And so we tried to make sure that these regulations weren't overly burdensome and also reflected the operational characteristics of food trucks so that we weren't doing things without understanding how they worked.
So you mentioned at several points today that 5 of the proposed changes relate to an expansion of where food trucks may operate. Talk about that.
Yeah, again, we're opening up areas where food trucks currently wouldn't be allowed. Industrial areas, for example, parks, residential areas in some circumstances, and so it expands where those trucks can locate. Also within the public right-of-way, there are areas where food trucks technically aren't allowed to park in the street right-of-way, but now they will be able to.
And so some of the restrictions that go along with that are simply meant to serve as sort of buffers to particular, whether it's a park or a school or a church within those residential neighborhoods, right?
That's right. In fact, most of the restrictions are to protect residential areas. You can't be so close to a home. If you're near a school, the school has to give permission to locate a food truck within 200 feet of the school. So those restrictions are to protect those residential areas and schools. There are a few others that, for example, we've made a distinction in the ordinance between food trucks that are truly mobile and moving around town versus those that want to set up at one location and basically stay there year-round. And so for those that want to stay year-round, some of the rules that apply to a standalone restaurant would also apply to those as what we're calling semi-permanent locations for food trucks.
And so that people aren't confused, part of the restrictions involved in operating in a residential neighborhood, for instance, are how much time a food truck can stay at any one particular place. So talk about that and why it was important.
That's right. We've gotten some locations where we thought it was important to allow food trucks, especially near residential, but limit the number of hours. So 4 hours at a time at a particular location so that you don't have, what we don't want is a food truck setting up in front of a home and being there all the time because really we've protected residential neighborhoods from that type of commercial activity. And while on the one hand we're opening it up to some of that commercial activity in the form of food trucks, we want to make sure we're still protecting those homes and the homeowners' investment in their neighborhood.
I think when a lot of people think of food trucks, they think about those operating downtown. So what are the new rules in regards to how food trucks may operate in our downtown area?
Well, one of the new rules would say that a food truck can't operate within 100 feet of an open and operating restaurant without that restaurant owner's permission. I think the idea is we've heard some concerns from restaurants, particularly downtown, where food trucks will pull up right in front of their restaurant. And restaurants have made a significant investment in our downtown, and not only to compete with them, but to use the public right-of-way and take up the parking spaces that are normally used by that restaurant's customers, it is kind of a double whammy against the restaurants. And so we want to provide some protection for those restaurants who have made that investment in downtown, while at the same time accommodating food trucks in the downtown as well.
So it's really a matter of balancing those competing interests.
That's right. And again, when we're talking about the ordinance, there are different rules that apply to private property. If you want to set up on a private property, you have much more free reign to do that with a food truck. But if you want to set up in the street, because it's the public street that we have an obligation to protect for traffic, for pedestrians, for parking, there's a little bit higher standard for how long you can be in a certain place and those kinds of things when you're talking about the street right-of-way itself.
You mentioned that you got some input from food truck vendors in crafting these new rules. Did they seem generally supportive of what was proposed today?
Yeah, most of the restrictions and the requirements, as we talked back and forth with many of the food truck owners, they were comfortable with what we ended up with in terms of an ordinance. We never get 100% agreement on anything like this, but as you saw from today's meeting, there were a couple of folks who spoke with some specific concerns, but largely most of the food truck owners had come to a consensus that this was a reasonable approach.
And they got to be happy that they're able to work and operate and compete in near parks and near schools and near churches.
Sure, absolutely.
And so, you know, it struck me as funny. Some people hear the word regulations or restrictions and they think that we're trying to crack down on food trucks. And from what I see with the work of your department and the city attorney's office and the health department, really and truly nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah, again, we looked at the proliferation of food trucks and we tried to look at our ordinances and see how can we better accommodate food trucks and encourage their growth. And that was the initial impetus for this from the very beginning.
You know, one of the things that was mentioned on our social media was that this was quote unquote a money grab by the city. We have approximately 30 food trucks in San Angelo. The permit for a food truck is $150 per year. So that's about $4,500 in revenue generated per year. And when you look at that in the context of the city's $75 million general fund budget, I don't know that argument holds much credence. But John, where do we go from here with these new rules?
Well, obviously the City Council is going to have to consider it on second reading. They did approve it today with a couple of minor changes, and so we'll come back later this month to the City Council with those changes. Once they're adopted, the City Council did give a 6-month grace period. Basically, the ordinance will go into effect, but we won't begin enforcing it for 6 months so that we can work with food trucks and their permanent base of operations to make sure that they can comply with all these regulations, but not making them effective immediately.
And I don't want to be the dark cloud over this issue because it sounds like generally good news for food trucks, but 6 months hence, if someone is in violation of the ordinance, what could potentially happen to a vendor in that sort of circumstance?
Well, generally what will happen is when they want to renew their permit each year, they won't be able to get their yearly permit without complying with these standards. Now that wouldn't apply till a year from now in January again, but in 6 months we would start looking at them and we could revoke a health permit, we could work with them to continue to come into compliance, but it could involve code enforcement and citations ultimately. But again, our goal is to work with them and try to get them to compliance, not necessarily crack down in terms of enforcement.
So if a food truck vendor is watching this right now and they're uncertain about the new rules and what they will be, what's the best way for them to get informed about these new regulations?
Well, they can always call our office, the Planning and Development Services, and talk to either me or one of our planners who are familiar with this proposed ordinance, and we'd be happy to try and answer any questions that they have. There's also the information that was provided to City Councils on the city's website. Once this ordinance gets adopted and rolls out, we've been working on new handouts and promotional type information that will be available once the ordinance is in place as well.
So we've been talking with John James. He is the Planning and Development Services Director for the City of San Angelo. So again, if you have any questions about food trucks, please contact the Planning and Development Services Department. Another issue of high importance, interest, and impact today at the City Council meeting was the annual street seal coating project. We thought it would be a little awkward to talk about food trucks and about street seal coating during the same programming. So if you'll tune back to our page in a few moments, we will be discussing the seal coating program with one of our city engineers. We are here to talk about the things of interest, importance, and impact that happened today during today's City Council meeting. And certainly one of those things was a discussion and some action on the city's annual street maintenance program. Of course, streets is the #2 priority of our City Council. So here to talk about that is one of our engineers, Mitchell Gatlin. Mitchell, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, when I talk about the street maintenance program, we also refer to it as the annual seal coat project. So tell us what seal coating is.
So all seal coating is a thin layer of asphalt and rock that's applied to a roadway to prevent the water from getting under the roadway, causing potholes, cracking. It's not designed nor intended to finish the road, resurface the road. It is a resurfacing, but it does not improve ride quality. Just preventative maintenance that extends the life of the roadway.
So if a lot of times we will see, as was the case on College Hills from the Loop to Valley View, that was called a mill and overlay project. That was a resurfacing of the roadway, provided a very smooth driving surface. This is not to be confused with that.
That is correct.
And you mentioned about water seeping into the roadway. So when that happens and it gets into the base of a roadway, what happens at that point?
So what happens is in the colder temperatures, you'll see what's called freeze-thaw effect, where as the water freezes, it will expand and heave, and it'll crack that roadway. It'll crack that flexible pavement over time. And then as cars drive over it, it wears it down. It doesn't have a sturdy base and substructure to be on.
And so that's when we see potholes.
Right.
So we are in the midst of an 8-year cycle in order to seal coat every city maintained street. What year of that 8-year cycle will this summer's seal coat project represent?
This year will represent year 4.
And so how much are we spending on seal coat this year in comparison to last year?
So this year, the contract's approximately $3.6 million. As far as last year, it was about $4 million. It's about a 10% decrease that we're seeing this year.
And will we be seal coating a comparable amount of streets as we did last year?
No, it's a reduced area, and a lot of the main reason for the reduced area is we've received funds back from a settlement from the 2013 failed seal coat, and so we were able to do more area last year to compensate for that, whereas this year is just within the 2019 project year.
And I understand that we are also using a better aggregate or rock in the seal coating project this year. So talk about why that decision was made and why this aggregate is more advantageous to use than what we've used in the past.
Right, so going back to what happened in 2013 is you had a lot of rock crushing, whereas this year we've had a local source come available that provides this higher end aggregate or rock, and its propensity to crush is significantly lower than what we've used in years past, and so we were able to get a comparative price on it and a competitive price on it this year because it's available locally.
I see. And so tell us where the seal coating of streets will occur this summer.
So mainly on your north and northwest sides of town, so Blackshear, Reagan, Riverside neighborhoods, the Angelo Heights neighborhood, and the Sherwood Park subdivisions kind of south of Arden Road.
All right. And when will this work be occurring?
We're looking at starting the 1st of July, but it could be even earlier than that.
And how long does it typically take to complete the seal coating project?
Depending on weather conditions and how fast the contractor moves, it could take anywhere from 30 to 60 days.
And so sometimes people complain about the rock that's either on the street or that's left afterwards. If they have those sort of concerns, is there anything that they can do in order to sort of bring that to our attention?
Yes, they can call our number, 325-657-4201, the engineering department's number. They can ask for me, and then I usually notify the contractor and let them know to go sweep. It is in our contract that they do sweep immediately after paving operations, and then they have to come back a month after and sweep again, do a second sweeping. But if that doesn't accomplish it, then we will most definitely be in contact with the contractor.
And so throughout the project, you and other inspectors are out making sure that the quality of work meets the specifications of the contract.
That is correct. We're constantly following what's called the distributor, which lays the asphalt down, and what's called the chip spreader, the rock spreader. We're calculating asphalt rates, the rock rates. We're making sure that all of that is staying within what we've specified and that it looks like a good application.
And this year we're going to be using a different contractor than we've used the past couple of years.
Right. So this year it's Fuquay Inc. who's doing it. They've never actually done anything for us before as far as paving operations or maintenance in general, but I have contacted a lot of their references and verified that all of their references gave them a great positive review.
And so again, this will be occurring in early July, and will the citizens who live on the streets that will be seal coated, will they receive some sort of advance notice of the work?
Yes, so it is in our contract with the contractor that they have to provide 7 days prior to construction, notifying those residents to move their vehicles and to be expecting those maintenance operations.
And so we ask that people please pay heed to that warning, move your vehicle. If the vehicle isn't moved, what happens with it?
So usually it's just skipped around, and that's what's called a skip, and so we lose that much surface area. The road doesn't get treated right there, and it could be another 7 or 8 years before they come back. Now, if the owner goes out there and moves that car and then calls us back, we try to hit. I mean, the contractor's going to be going down as they're seal coating. They're going to be knocking on doors, doing whatever they can to get those cars out of the roadway.
Is there any possibility that those cars may be towed?
No, actually, we do have an ordinance in place, but towing has been kind of up in the air.
Okay. And so if our viewers want more information about this, I would suggest that they go to our website, costatx.us/engineering. Mitchell is one of our engineers who is overseeing this project. Earlier, we recorded a segment about another hot topic during today's City Council meeting, and that was in regards to food truck rules. So if you missed that, we encourage you to go to our page and watch that discussion with our Planning and Services Director. And if you have any questions about either seal coating or food truck rules, please post those in the comment of these videos. We'll be happy to respond.